On a clear summer morning in Asheville, North Carolina, in the early 21st century, the first buses roll in before the sun has fully burned the mist off the hills. Doors open. People step down. They adjust their phones, check tickets, and follow the path toward a house that was never meant for them. Inside, the rooms are already awake. Light slips through tall windows and lands on carved wood, stone floors, and furniture arranged for a family that is no longer here. Somewhere near the entrance, a gift shop turns on its lights. In the distance, a guide rehearses the same sentences they have said hundreds of times before. Guests smile, they pose, they take photographs in a dining room where no breakfast will ever be served again. The house absorbs their footsteps without reacting. It does not resist. It does not explain itself. It simply allows the day to begin. Very few of the people walking these halls know the name of the man who built this place. Even fewer understand why a private home ended up needing crowds to survive. They see beauty, they feel scale, they sense history, but only in fragments. What they are standing inside of is not just a mansion and not exactly a museum. It is a solution. And to understand why this house is still alive while its owner vanished long ago, we have to go back to the moment when it was first imagined. This is the story of George Washington Vanderbilt II and the house he built in the mountains of North Carolina. On the surface, it looks like a triumph of the American Gilded Age. Railroad money, unlimited resources, a private estate larger than any home ever built in the country. But this is not a story about beauty alone. It is a story about scale, about what happens when ambition grows faster than the life meant to contain it. Vanderbilt came from a family where wealth moved at the speed of steel and rail, where money did not ask for permission, and size was proof of success, from inherited power to a vision of total control, to a home that demanded more than any family could give. That is the first arc. The second is quieter and more painful. A dream meant to escape the world, a house designed to protect a private life, and a cost so high that privacy itself became impossible. Biltmore was not built as a museum. It was not designed to welcome crowds. It was created as a personal kingdom, complete and self-contained. But history does not care about intention. When economic pressure arrived and the world changed, the house did not shrink. It did not adapt gently. It forced a decision. To survive, it had to open its doors. By the time this story ends, you will understand why the largest private home in America could not remain private, why a family legacy became a business model, and why this house still stands today, not as a residence, but as a solution. To see how that transformation began, we have to return to the moment before the house existed, to the man who believed size could buy permanence. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in the year 1862 into a family where money did not arrive quietly. It moved with engines, schedules, and steel. His grandfather had built the railroad empire that stitched together the American economy. And by the time George was a child, wealth was not something to be earned. It was something to be managed, displayed, and protected. He grew up surrounded by houses that were already large, already impressive, already proof that the family name carried weight. But even inside that world, George felt like an observer rather than a commander. He was smaller in presence, quieter in temperament, more interested in books than in boardrooms. While other Vanderbilts measured success in roots and returns, George measured it in control and distance. He did not dream of expanding the empire. He dreamed of stepping away from it. The late 19th century was an age that rewarded scale above all else. Bigger factories, bigger fortunes, bigger homes. In that climate, restraint looked like weakness, privacy looked like retreat, and yet, that was exactly what George wanted. Not a public palace in New York, not a townhouse meant for constant display. He wanted space that answered only to him. A place where wealth could finally stop moving and settle. But being born into unlimited resources came with an invisible pressure. When money has no ceiling, ambition has no natural boundary either. From the beginning, George Vanderbilt did not face the problem of how to rise. He faced a more dangerous one: How big is enough? The world George Vanderbilt came of age in was not neutral. It was a system designed to reward expansion and punish restraint. The late 19th century in America was shaped by railroads, industrial capital, and a growing belief that success had to be visible to be real. Cities grew upward, fortunes grew outward. Families like the Vanderbilts were expected to perform their wealth in public, through buildings, philanthropy, and constant social presence. Anything less looked like decline. For a man like George, who valued privacy and control, this world felt crowded. New York demanded appearances. Society demanded hosting. Even leisure became a form of labor. Behind the scenes, the same system that created unlimited wealth also produced instability. Booms were followed by crashes. Markets shifted quickly. Political pressure mounted around large fortunes. Wealth was powerful, but it was also watched. In this environment, retreat was not just a personal desire. It was a strategic response. George did not trust the city to leave him alone. He did not trust public life to stay gentle. He wanted distance from scrutiny and insulation from volatility. At the same time, American culture offered him a dangerous idea. That land could solve everything. Space meant freedom. Isolation meant safety. If the city was pressure, the countryside was relief. If public life was noise, nature was silence. This belief was deeply rooted in the era, especially among elites who could afford to act on it. But there was a contradiction hiding inside that dream. To truly escape the system, George would have to use its full power. Only massive capital could buy total separation. Only industrial wealth could create a private world large enough to disappear inside. The pressure of the age did not push him to build small. It pushed him to build something unprecedented. What began as a desire for quiet slowly turned into a project of scale. And once scale entered the equation, the system he was trying to escape followed him there. The decision that changed everything did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It formed slowly, through reading, travel, and long stretches of observation. George Vanderbilt read about European estates where land, architecture, and daily life existed as one controlled environment. He visited places where distance itself functioned as protection. The idea stayed with him. If privacy could not survive inside the city, it might survive outside of it. But not just anywhere. It had to be far enough to feel removed, yet reachable enough to be governed. Mountains offered both. The American South, still largely rural in the late 19th century, promised space without constant scrutiny. Asheville stood out. Clean air, rolling hills, rail access without social density. It was not an escape from civilization. It was a repositioning within it. Once the location entered his mind, the logic of scale followed almost automatically. A modest retreat would not be enough. Staff would still be needed. Infrastructure would still be required. Land would still have to buffer the house from the outside world. Each layer of protection demanded another layer of size. What began as a personal withdrawal turned into a comprehensive plan. Control the land, control the buildings, control the rhythm of life inside the gates. This was not a house meant to grow over time. It was conceived whole. From the start, George imagined a finished world. Forests managed, farms operating, roads planned. The estate would not depend on the town around it, it would replace it. In making that choice, George Vanderbilt crossed an invisible line. He stopped thinking like a homeowner and began thinking like a founder. The project ahead of him was no longer about shelter or comfort. It was about permanence, about building something that could stand apart from the system that created it. But permanence has a cost, and once that cost is built into the walls, it never leaves. With the land chosen and the vision fixed, there was no turning back. The house had not been drawn yet, but its future had already been decided. The project that would become Biltmore Estate did not begin with sketches of towers or rooms. It began with systems. George Vanderbilt approached the task the way industrial America approached everything else in the late 19th century, methodically, at scale. With the assumption that enough money could turn vision into structure, he assembled architects, engineers, landscape designers, and agricultural planners before a single wall was raised. This was not a house looking for land. It was an operation looking for a headquarters. The first priority was control. Roads were cut. Rail connections were secured. Forests were mapped and reorganized. Farms were planned not for charm, but for function. Every acre had a role. Every building was meant to serve the whole. The house would sit at the center, but it would not stand alone. Around it grew an ecosystem designed to support permanence. Construction itself became a demonstration of power. Materials arrived from across the country and beyond. Stone was hauled. Wood was shaped on site. Hundreds of workers moved through the valley, according to schedules that resembled a factory more than a home build. There was no sense of experimentation, only execution. Vanderbilt did not intend to revise later. He intended to finish once. In that mindset, excess was not waste. It was insurance. If something broke, it would be replaced. If something aged, it would be maintained. If something cost more than expected, the answer was not to reduce scale, but to absorb the expense. That logic made sense inside the world of railroad wealth, where losses were temporary and capital was assumed to regenerate. What emerged from this phase was not yet a castle, but a commitment. Once the land was reshaped and the workforce organized, the project became irreversible. Even before the house stood, the estate had already begun consuming resources at a level that required constant input. The build phase locked in a future where the house would always need to be fed. In choosing to construct at this scale, George Vanderbilt was not simply building a residence. He was founding a machine, and machines do not slow down just because their owners grow tired. As the structure began to rise, the vision sharpened into something unmistakable. This was not an American country house borrowing from Europe. It was a deliberate attempt to recreate authority through architecture. George Vanderbilt chose a French Renaissance vocabulary, not for nostalgia, but for order. Stone walls thick enough to signal permanence. Roof lines designed to dominate the surrounding hills. Windows placed to control light and sight lines rather than invite them. Inside, rooms were arranged by function and hierarchy. Public spaces announced scale. Private spaces enforced separation. The great halls were meant to impress guests who arrived after long journeys. The quieter rooms were meant to seal the family away from them. Every decision carried a message. This place was built to be complete. The house did not exist apart from the land. It commanded it. Gardens were shaped to extend the building outward. Vistas were cleared to frame the house as the natural center of the valley. Even the approach road was engineered to slow arrival and heighten anticipation. By the time a visitor reached the main doors, the scale had already done its work. Inside, comfort followed control. Fireplaces multiplied not for warmth alone, but for redundancy. Libraries held thousands of volumes not to be read all at once, but to signify depth and stability. Service corridors allowed staff to move unseen, so that the illusion of effortlessness could remain intact. This was not luxury for pleasure. It was luxury as system. A home that operated like an institution. What mattered most was not how beautiful the rooms were, but how much they demanded to stay alive. Stone requires maintenance. Wood requires labor. Heat requires fuel. Staff requires wages. The architecture locked those needs into place. Each wing added cost. Each room added obligation. The larger the house became, the less it could ever retreat. By choosing architecture that celebrated scale and permanence, George Vanderbilt accepted a future where downsizing was impossible. The building could not be folded back into a simpler life. It could only move forward. In that sense, the design was honest. It revealed the truth early. This was not a home that could adapt to its owner. It was a home that required its owner to adapt to it. And once the walls stood and the roofs closed, that relationship was fixed. By the time construction neared completion in the final years of the 19th century, the scale of what had been created could no longer be separated from the life meant to inhabit it. The house stood finished, but it did not arrive quietly into use. It demanded immediate organization. Hundreds of rooms required heating, cleaning, and repair. Kitchens needed constant supply. Stables, fields, and forests needed schedules and supervision. Staff numbers rose not as a luxury, but as a requirement. The estate began operating before the family fully settled in. This was the moment when the logic of the project revealed itself. The house did not wait for George Vanderbilt to decide how to live inside it. It had already decided for him. Daily routines were shaped by maintenance rather than preference. Movement followed corridors designed for efficiency. Privacy depended on staff discipline rather than isolation. Even moments of rest were framed by the knowledge that everything surrounding them was working. The cost of keeping the house perfect was not abstract. It was constant. Every season brought new needs. Winter demanded fuel. Summer demanded labor. Time demanded repairs. There was no off switch. The scale that once promised escape now enforced obligation. And yet, the success of the build created its own momentum. To question the project would have meant questioning the years already invested. So the answer was always forward. More organization, more systems, more spending. The house had crossed the point where it could be evaluated as a choice. It existed as a fact. In that sense, the true construction of the estate was not the stone or wood, but the dependency it created. From this point on, the family would not ask whether the house was worth it. They would ask how to keep it going. That subtle shift mattered. It marked the transition from ownership to stewardship, from private residence to managed asset. The build phase ended with a triumph of form, but it quietly introduced a permanent condition. The house would always need to be justified by its operation. Even in moments of comfort, the question lingered: how long can one family support something this large? The answer would not come immediately, but it was already built into the walls. With the estate complete and functioning, the next chapter could begin. A chapter defined not by construction, but by life inside a structure that never stopped asking for more. When life finally settled into the house, it did so with ceremony. The early years at Biltmore unfolded like a carefully staged season. Guests arrived by carriage and later by train, stepping out after long journeys into a world designed to receive them. Evenings began with movement through vast rooms that softened scale with ritual. Coats were taken, doors closed, fires were lit. Music carried across stone and wood in a way that made the house feel alive rather than immense. Dinners followed a rhythm that was both social and strategic. Seating reflected hierarchy. Conversation flowed around books, travel, and ideas rather than deals. This was a space where wealth did not need to prove itself. It assumed attention and waited. Summers stretched outward into the grounds. Walks through gardens felt choreographed but unforced. Horses moved across fields that were as managed as the rooms inside. The house did not end at its walls. It extended into the land, and the land responded by framing the house as its center. Inside, different rooms carried different energies. The library absorbed quiet hours and private thought. The dining spaces gathered people into shared time. Verandas allowed distance without absence. Children moved through these spaces with ease, unaware of the systems required to make them effortless. Staff presence remained precise and invisible. Meals appeared, rooms reset, paths cleared. The success of the golden years rested on that invisibility. The house felt calm because labor stayed out of sight. What made this period feel stable was not just wealth, but predictability. Seasons repeated, traditions formed. The scale that once threatened to overwhelm now seemed contained by routine. For a moment, the estate appeared to have found its balance. The house listened. It watched. It held conversations in its walls and laughter in its ceilings. It gave the impression of permanence, not through force, but through repetition. These were the years that made the later transformation painful. Because when a place works this well, it convinces its inhabitants that it will keep working forever. Nothing in these moments hinted at urgency. Nothing suggested retreat. From the inside, the golden age felt complete. From the outside, it looked untouchable, and that illusion would matter later, when the house began asking for more than even these years could provide. Over time, the house began to teach everyone inside it how to behave, not through rules, but through space. Certain rooms pulled people together, others quietly kept them apart. The largest public areas created momentum. Conversations started easily and lasted longer than planned. Decisions felt lighter when made beneath high ceilings. Smaller rooms slowed everything down. Voices softened, time stretched. The house shaped emotion by scale alone. Family life adapted to that rhythm. Meals happened when the house was ready for them. Walks followed paths that had already been cleared and framed. Even solitude was scheduled by architecture. Privacy did not mean isolation. It meant retreating into rooms designed to absorb presence without returning it. The household staff understood this language instinctively. They moved along invisible routes and appeared only when needed. Doors opened before being noticed. Fires burned at the right hour. Lamps glowed at a level that suggested care without intrusion. The success of daily life depended on this choreography. When it worked, the house felt effortless. When it faltered, the scale became obvious. Guests rarely saw the labor that sustained the illusion. They experienced comfort without context. That contrast was part of the design. The house protected its image by hiding its cost. Children grew up assuming that rooms would always be warm and tables always set. They learned the house as a given fact rather than a fragile system. That belief shaped memory. The Golden Age is remembered not for what it required, but for how it felt. Stable, generous, quietly confident. Yet beneath that calm surface, the estate never stopped counting. Supplies were tracked, staff schedules adjusted, repairs planned seasons in advance. Nothing was spontaneous at this scale. What looked like ease was the result of constant attention. The house demanded presence even when no one was watching. It trained its inhabitants to think in advance and react early. In doing so, it created a subtle dependency. Life at Biltmore worked because everything else revolved around it. The family did not simply live in the house. They lived for it. At its best, this relationship felt harmonious. At its worst, it was invisible. And invisibility is dangerous. Because when a system runs perfectly, it discourages questions. It convinces people that balance has been achieved permanently, that the arrangement will hold. During these years, no one spoke openly about limits. The house did not show strain. It rewarded care with comfort and silence. That silence made the future harder to read. The Golden Age did not end with a warning. It simply continued. And by continuing so smoothly, it delayed the moment when anyone would ask how long this way of life could last. From the outside, these years later came to be called the Golden Age. From the inside, they felt like continuity. Nothing dramatic marked the passage of time. There was no single summer that stood apart. Instead, there was repetition. Holidays returned on schedule. Guests arrived and departed along familiar paths. Rooms were prepared in the same order. Fires were lit at the same hour. This sameness created comfort. It also created belief. The belief that the system worked because it was meant to work. The house seemed to confirm that idea every day. It absorbed effort and returned stability. It took labor and gave silence. It took money and gave routine. Over time, that exchange stopped feeling like a trade and started feeling like nature. People spoke of the estate as if it had always been this way and always would be. The language shifted. Not how much does it cost, but how it runs. Not can we afford this, but what does it need next? The house quietly redefined priorities. Decisions were framed around its calendar. Absences were planned so that the estate never felt unattended. Even joy adjusted itself to scale. Celebrations grew larger but more formal. Intimacy survived but within boundaries set by architecture and schedule. The house allowed closeness but never spontaneity. And because it delivered comfort so consistently, it discouraged doubt. It was difficult to imagine failure inside rooms that felt so settled. Difficult to imagine limits inside spaces that seemed endless. The Golden Age did not feel excessive to those living in it. It felt appropriate, earned, balanced. That perception mattered. It delayed recognition. It postponed questions about sustainability. By the time the first real pressures appeared, they would feel external, like interruptions rather than consequences. Looking back, these years appear fragile because of what followed. At the time, they felt solid. The house had trained its inhabitants well. It rewarded maintenance with calm and punished neglect with immediate discomfort. That feedback loop kept attention focused inward, on rooms, on schedules, on continuity, not on vulnerability. The greatest achievement of the Golden Age was not luxury, it was normalcy. The ability to make something so vast feel ordinary. That was also its quiet danger. Because when a structure this large feels normal, it becomes hard to see when the ground beneath it begins to shift. And when that shift comes, it does not announce itself with noise. It begins as a subtle change in rhythm, a pause where there was once certainty, a question where there was once assumption. The Golden Age ended not with collapse, but with hesitation. and hesitation is easy to miss until it has already changed everything. The earliest signs of strain appeared as choices framed as care. Nothing broke, nothing failed. Instead, the house asked for attention in quieter ways. A repair scheduled later in the year, a room kept closed a little longer between seasons, a gathering shortened to preserve energy rather than tradition. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they altered the tempo of daily life. Expenses that once disappeared into abundance began to demand explanation. Heating costs rose as winters pressed harder against stone. Labor costs rose as skilled hands became harder to keep. Time itself became an expense as materials aged and systems wore down. The estate still functioned. That was the danger. Function masked direction. Inside, the household language shifted almost without notice. Conversations moved from custom to calculation, from how we do things to how often we can afford to do them. Stewardship replaced ease. Planning replaced instinct. At the same time, the outside world grew less forgiving. Fortunes tied to old assumptions faced scrutiny. Markets behaved with less patience. Public attitudes toward scale changed. None of this struck as a blow. It accumulated. Letters arrived asking for clarification. Accounts required review. Seasons demanded restraint. Inside the house, the atmosphere responded subtly. Some rooms felt quieter than before. Corridors seemed longer when fewer footsteps crossed them. Staff adjusted routes and duties to maintain the same results with fewer resources. Guests noticed nothing. That invisibility was deliberate. The house had been designed to protect its image even under pressure. But protection has a cost. The margin that once absorbed fluctuation narrowed. Decisions carried consequences they had not carried before. The family spoke carefully. Prudence became a virtue. Efficiency became a goal. Those words sound responsible. They are. They also mark a turning point. When a residence this large requires constant justification, it has already changed its role. It is no longer simply lived in, it is managed. The cracks at this stage were thin and easily ignored. They did not threaten collapse, they threatened comfort. And comfort is what had made the golden years feel permanent. The estate did not demand sacrifice yet, it demanded vigilance. And vigilance alters behavior. It shifts focus from living to maintaining, from presence to oversight. Nothing dramatic announced this change. The house still stood proud and complete. But beneath that confidence, it had begun to ask questions it never needed to ask before. How much attention can be sustained? How many adjustments can be made? And what happens when attention runs out? As pressure grew, the strain began to touch people rather than schedules. What had once been background effort moved into the foreground of daily decisions. Conversations that used to drift now ended with calculations. Invitations were weighed, travel was reconsidered. Even hospitality acquired limits. The house remained gracious but less forgiving. It demanded coordination. It required presence. Absence became noticeable because every absence created a gap that someone else had to fill. Inside the family, the emotional temperature cooled. Not from conflict, but from fatigue. Maintaining the estate required attention that could not be set aside. It followed them through meals and walks and quiet hours. Private time narrowed as responsibility expanded. Children sensed the shift without understanding it. Adults spoke in careful tones. The house absorbed stress and reflected it back as silence. At the same time, the systems that supported the estate revealed their complexity. Infrastructure that had once felt invisible required upgrades. Gardens required labor that could not be rushed. Mechanical systems demanded expertise that could not be improvised. Each solution solved one problem and created another obligation. The estate became a chain of dependencies. Miss one link and pressure traveled quickly. The outside world offered little relief. Cultural attitudes toward large private estates changed. Public curiosity grew sharper. Criticism followed size. The question was no longer how impressive the house was, but why it existed at all. That shift did not threaten ownership directly. It threatened confidence. The sense that scale itself justified effort weakened. Inside the house, routines adapted again. Fewer spontaneous gatherings, more scheduled ones. Rooms closed, not for repair, but for rest. Rest became a strategy. This was not decline. It was compression. Life narrowed to what could be sustained. The house still hosted. It still impressed. But the margin for error had vanished. Every choice carried consequences. Every delay multiplied cost. This stage felt busy rather than dramatic. There was always something to manage, something to explain, something to prepare for. That constant motion disguised fragility, activity felt like control. In reality, it was containment. The estate had shifted from being a setting for life to being a project that life revolved around. That inversion mattered, because once a home becomes a project, it competes with the people inside it. Attention becomes finite, energy becomes strategic, and affection becomes scheduled. None of this announced itself as crisis. It presented itself as maturity, as responsibility, as the price of keeping something extraordinary intact. But extraordinary things do not remain neutral. They demand payment. And by this point, the house had begun collecting it in quieter currency: time, focus, and emotional distance. By the time the cracks became visible, they no longer looked like choices. They looked like patterns. What began as careful adjustment hardened into habit. Habit became expectation. The estate no longer asked whether something should be done. It asked when and at what cost. That question followed every decision. The house still projected confidence. Visitors still saw scale and order and beauty. Inside, the work of holding that image together intensified. Small delays triggered larger consequences. A postponed repair meant a closed room. A closed room shifted circulation. Shifted circulation increased labor elsewhere. Pressure moved through the system like water through connected pipes. There was no single point to fix, only constant management. The family felt this acutely. Time together became fragmented. Presence was divided between people and process. Moments that once belonged to leisure now belonged to oversight. The house required checks and confirmations and follow-ups. It rewarded attention with stability and punished distraction with immediate discomfort. That dynamic trained behavior. Vigilance replaced ease. Caution replaced generosity. The estate did not collapse. It narrowed. Options reduced quietly. Traditions shortened. Expectations softened. These changes were framed as sensible, as necessary, as temporary. Temporary has a way of settling in. Outside pressures added weight. Economic cycles tightened. Public sentiment continued to shift. Large private spaces drew questions rather than admiration. The estate could withstand scrutiny. What it could not escape was context. It existed in a world that no longer granted patience to scale alone. Inside the house, this reality registered as restraint. Fewer risks, more rules, fewer assumptions, more reviews. The energy of the place changed, not toward despair, but toward caution. Caution slows movement. It lengthens days. It turns every decision into a calculation. The cracks were now structural in behavior rather than stone. The walls still stood. The ceiling still held. But the way people moved through them had changed. They moved carefully. They moved with awareness of consequence. This was the moment the house crossed a threshold. It ceased to be a backdrop for life and became an active force shaping it. That shift is easy to miss because it feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels like survival. In truth, it marked the end of innocence, the end of the belief that scale could be maintained without cost. From here forward, the estate would no longer coast on momentum. It would require decisions that narrowed the future in order to protect the present. Nothing dramatic announced this passage. No single event defined it. The change lived in routine, in tone, in the quiet understanding that the house had begun to outgrow the people inside it. The final pressure did not arrive as a single blow. It gathered quietly and then refused to leave. What had been manageable, strain hardened into limits that could no longer bend. Cash flow tightened as obligations stayed fixed. The cost of care did not scale down with sentiment or patience. It stayed exact. Taxes came due. Payroll came due. Repairs that had been delayed reached the end of delay. The estate asked for the same attention it always had, but the margin to give it was gone. Decisions that once adjusted rhythm now determined survival. Each choice closed a door. Each solution narrowed the next option. The house was no longer being balanced. It was being held up. Inside the family, this reality landed unevenly. Some argued for preservation at any cost. Others saw the math and the exhaustion and understood that something fundamental had to change. Conversations grew shorter and more careful. Silence filled the spaces where certainty used to live. The house amplified that silence. Rooms that once hosted confidence now echoed calculation. Outside forces pressed in at the same time. Economic shocks reshaped assumptions across the country. Wealth tied to older systems lost its insulation. Public appetite for private excess evaporated. What had once been admired now invited scrutiny. The estate could not escape these currents. It was too large to hide and too expensive to pause. The moment came when the question was no longer how to keep everything as it was, but which part could be sacrificed. That question is never abstract. It is felt in rooms and schedules and faces. The act of choosing carries consequence beyond finance. It changes identity. For a family defined by creation and stewardship, the idea of release felt like failure, even when it was rational. The house offered no guidance. It simply remained, demanding, unmoved. The tragedy of this stage was not a single dramatic act. It was accumulation. The slow realization that effort no longer restored balance, that vigilance no longer bought stability, that the system had crossed a point where maintenance consumed more than it returned. The estate did not collapse in noise or scandal. It cornered its keepers with arithmetic and time. By the end of this phase, the outcome was no longer a surprise. It was a conclusion waiting for a moment. And when that moment arrived, it would not feel sudden. It would feel inevitable, like the final step after a long, narrowing path. The house had not failed them. It had outgrown the conditions that once made it possible. The decisive moment unfolded not in spectacle, but in paperwork and meetings. Ledgers replaced invitations. Advisors replaced guests. The house waited while numbers spoke. There was no argument with arithmetic. The costs were steady. The income was not. What had once been buffered by confidence now required structure. Choices narrowed to those that could be defended rather than desired. The idea of opening the estate to the public entered the room without ceremony. At first, it sounded temporary, a bridge, a measure to regain footing, but once spoken, it changed everything. A private home carries one logic. A public destination carries another. Paths that had been intimate became routes. Rooms that had held memory became exhibits. Time inside the house shifted from lived to scheduled. This was not an emotional decision alone. It was operational. Staffing changed. Access points multiplied. Security replaced discretion. The family confronted a loss that did not look like loss at first. The walls remained theirs. The name remained theirs. But the meaning of ownership shifted. Control moved from use to policy, from instinct to procedure. The tragedy here was not humiliation. It was translation. A life translated into an experience. A home translated into a product. Outside pressure validated the move. Visitors arrived curious rather than reverent. They came to see scale and craft and history. Their presence stabilized finances but altered atmosphere. The house adapted quickly because it had to. Signs appeared, schedules posted, narratives standardized. What had once been implied now had to be explained. The estate survived. But survival required performance. Inside the family, the cost registered quietly. Privacy thinned. Silence became rare. The rhythms of daily life bent around crowds and seasons. What had been a refuge became a workplace. That shift is difficult to name because it looks successful. Attendance grows. Revenue steadies. Headlines soften. But something essential changes when a house begins to justify itself to strangers. The rooms learn new voices. The walls hold different questions. The decision solved an immediate problem and created a permanent condition. There was no return to before. The house had crossed a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. It now existed in two times at once, as a memory of private life and as a stage for public consumption. The tragedy of this phase lies in that split. Preservation required exposure. Stability required surrender. The estate remained intact by giving up the very thing it had been built to protect, a family life unseen. From this point forward, the house would endure not as a home, but as an argument for its own existence. Once the decision settled, there was no dramatic aftermath inside the walls. No single room was sealed forever. No object was declared untouchable. The tragedy expressed itself through continuity under new rules. The house kept opening its doors each morning. Visitors kept arriving, guides kept speaking. The estate functioned smoothly because it had learned how to do so. What disappeared was not operation, but ownership of time. The family became guests in a place that still carried their name. Their presence had to fit the schedule. Their privacy had to be negotiated. The rooms no longer belonged to memory alone. They belonged to expectation. Each space now carried two lives. One remembered and one performed. That duality settled into routine. The house grew fluent in it. It displayed history while absorbing wear. It told stories while collecting tickets. The tragedy here was quiet and durable. Nothing could be pointed to. As the moment, everything was lost. Loss stretched across years. It appeared as distance, as restraint, as the gradual thinning of personal connection to rooms that once held private meaning. The estate survived the pressures that might have ended it. But survival required surrender of intimacy. That exchange cannot be reversed. A public place does not forget its audience. The walls adjusted, the staff adapted, the system stabilized. What remained unsettled was the sense of belonging. The family did not lose the house in a legal sense. They lost it in a lived sense. It became impossible to inhabit it without explanation, without supervision, without context. The house demanded clarity because strangers required it. That clarity erased ambiguity, and ambiguity is where private life lives. The final shape of the tragedy is not collapse, but permanence. The estate endured by fixing itself into a role. It would no longer change with its inhabitants. It would outlast them by repeating itself, day after day, season after season. This outcome looks like success from the outside. Attendance numbers rise. Preservation awards follow. The structure stands. But endurance is not the same as belonging. The house that was built to shelter a family became a structure that shelters an idea. That idea is stability through access, history through exposure. The cost of that idea is subtle but complete. A home cannot remain a home once it must explain itself every hour. The tragedy ends not with ruin but with function. A place perfectly maintained, perfectly narrated, and permanently separated from the life that once justified its existence. After the transition, the estate entered a new life, defined by continuity without inheritance. The family name remained attached, but the daily logic belonged to institutions rather than individuals. Management plans replaced personal judgment. Preservation schedules replaced intuition. What had once been a private rhythm became an operational calendar, measured in seasons and visitor flow. The house learned how to survive by repeating itself. Tours followed fixed paths. Stories settled into approved language. Maintenance cycles tightened. Revenue streams diversified around access rather than possession. The estate no longer waited for the family to decide what mattered. It followed policy. That shift stabilized the structure. It also flattened experience. Rooms were kept in a state of permanent readiness. Nothing could age too visibly. Nothing could change too freely. The house was preserved at a moment chosen not for truth, but for legibility. This afterlife required scale. Attendance mattered. Events expanded. Partnerships formed. The grounds hosted gatherings that brought energy and cash, but diluted intimacy. The estate became a platform. Wine labels, seasonal festivals, educational programs. Each edition made sense on its own. Together, they transformed purpose. The house now existed to be visited rather than lived in. That difference is subtle but decisive. A lived place tolerates mess and silence. A visited place cannot. Silence becomes awkward. Mess becomes risk. Everything must explain itself. The business survived and then thrived because it embraced this clarity. But clarity has a cost. The narrative narrowed. Complexity softened. Contradiction was edited out. What remained was an image of endurance. The estate stood as proof that transformation could save a structure, even if it changed its soul. The afterlife did not erase history. It curated it. Curated histories move forward by standing still. The house stopped evolving with people and began repeating for crowds. That repetition created stability that had never existed before. It also created distance. The family became part of the story rather than its center. Their decisions lived on as policy rather than memory. The estate succeeded in the only way left to it, by becoming useful to many rather than meaningful to a few. From the outside, this looks like triumph. The house stands. The grounds flourish. The numbers work. From the inside, it is quieter. The afterlife of the estate is efficient and durable. It is also final. Once a home learns how to live without its inhabitants, it rarely invites them back, except as names on walls and voices in audio guides. As the estate matured into its public life, the business logic deepened and spread. What began as access became ecosystem. Operations expanded beyond tours into hospitality, agriculture, and retail. Each addition promised resilience. Together, they created dependence. Revenue now flowed from seasons, promotions, and attendance patterns rather than private wealth. That shift protected the structure from single shocks, but tied it tightly to trends and perception. The house learned to read calendars and forecasts. Weather mattered. Holidays mattered. Public mood mattered. The estate adjusted pricing, staffing, and programming to stay aligned. This was competence, not compromise. It kept doors open and roofs intact. It also locked the house into motion. Stillness became costly. Quiet days became losses. The grounds filled with activity designed to convert presence into support. Tastings, markets, exhibitions, celebrations. Each event refreshed interest and extended reach. The house became a brand with a schedule. Branding simplified story. Complexity softened into themes. Grandeur became experience. Labor became service. The work was professional and effective. It also reframed value. Rooms were no longer important because of what happened there, but because of what could be explained there. Gardens mattered for how they photographed. Views mattered for how they circulated. The estate was not hollowed out. It was optimized. Optimization preserved surfaces while thinning depth. Inside the organization, decisions prioritized continuity over nuance. Anything that confused visitors was adjusted. Anything that slowed flow was redesigned. The afterlife rewarded clarity. It punished ambiguity. Over time, the house became excellent at being understood. That excellence came with distance from its origin. The family legacy remained present but abstracted. Names became labels. Stories became scripts. The estate did not forget its founders. It reframed them to fit modern attention. This reframing kept memory alive while changing its texture. The past felt accessible but resolved. Conflicts faded, doubts quieted. What remained was an arc of endurance. That arc satisfied audiences and sustained operations. It also flattened contradiction. The house now belonged to many expectations at once. Preservation groups, visitors, staff, partners, vendors. Meeting those expectations required balance and repetition. The estate learned to be dependable. Dependability replaced intimacy. From a distance, this looked like success multiplied. From within, it felt like discipline extended. The afterlife achieved what private ownership could not. Stability at scale. But scale demands sacrifice. It asks for simplification and speed. The house gave both. It became a place where nothing surprising happened by accident. Surprise was scheduled. Emotion was guided. History was paced. This was not betrayal. It was adaptation. The estate survived by becoming legible to a world that moves quickly and forgets easily. In doing so, it secured its future while narrowing the ways that future could be lived. In its final afterlife, the estate settled into something stable and impersonal. The systems worked, the calendars held, the numbers aligned often enough to justify confidence. What changed was not outcome, but meaning. The house no longer asked who it served. That question had been answered by process. It served continuity. It served preservation. It served an audience that arrived in waves and left with photographs and phrases. The estate became excellent at delivering the same day again and again. That repetition protected it from decay. It also fixed it in time. Change became incremental and reversible. Risk became procedural. The house learned how to exist without surprise. This condition is not failure. It is a kind of peace built on agreement. Everyone involved understands the role. Staff maintain. Visitors observe. Partners promote. The structure stands between them and does not choose. In this equilibrium, the family legacy persists without friction. It is honored, but not consulted. Remembered, but not felt. The estate carries their name as a signal rather than a presence. Their lives are summarized rather than lived. This is how large places survive long spans. They reduce emotion to information. The afterlife is efficient because it removes ambiguity. But ambiguity is where homes breathe. Without it, the house becomes a surface that resists imprint. People pass through and leave little behind. The estate absorbs foot traffic, not memory. It keeps itself intact by refusing intimacy. That refusal is quiet and complete. Nothing inside asks for belonging. Everything asks for order. The tragedy at this stage is subtle because it feels resolved. There is no crisis to point at, no villain to blame. The house stands because it learned how to stand alone. It does not lean on family wealth or private patience anymore. It leans on systems and demand. This makes it durable. It also makes it finished. The story has reached a form that does not evolve. It repeats. That repetition will carry it forward for decades. It will be photographed. It will be narrated. It will be maintained. What it will not do is surprise the people who know it best. The afterlife ends not with disappearance, but with certainty. A certainty that everything has its place and function. In that certainty, the house is safe. And in that safety, it is closed. The final shape of survival is a place that can be visited endlessly without ever being entered. The estate lives on, but it lives on as an answer rather than a question. Now, the walk through the house feels slower than time itself. Each room presents a version of calm that has been practiced for years. The floors are clean, the walls are steady, light enters exactly where it is meant to. Nothing here argues with the past. Nothing here rushes the future. The estate does not hide its history, but it no longer carries it with weight. The tragedies that once bent this place have been flattened into sequence. Visitors move along a path that feels gentle and complete. They are shown where to stand and where to look. Silence fills the gaps between facts. This silence is intentional. It keeps emotion from spilling. It keeps judgment from forming too quickly. The house has learned how to guide attention without forcing belief. It lets you see enough to feel informed, but not enough to feel involved. That distance is the final protection. It ensures the estate can be understood without being reopened. As you leave the last room, there is no final reveal, no sharp ending, just continuity. The house remains behind you exactly as it was when you entered. That is the point. It does not change with you. You change around it. This is how the story closes. Not with a collapse, not with a warning, but with a structure that has absorbed every version of ambition and loss, and learned how to stand unchanged. The mansion survives by becoming neutral. It carries success and failure with the same posture. It offers beauty without promise, memory without demand. This balance is what allows it to persist. And this persistence is the quiet cost. Because a place that no longer asks anything of its people also no longer belongs to them. The estate endures, but it endures as an object of passage rather than a site of living. The final image is simple. Doors closing softly, footsteps fading. The house remains. Waiting is no longer required. The story has been contained. What once felt personal has become permanent. And permanence is not the same as life. It is simply what remains when all motion has found its limit.